This episode of the Real Estate Ripple is brought to you by Three Rivers Association of Realtors. Big changes are here, CHARM members. The brand new 8.0 residential real estate contract and updated addendums are rolling out, and we've got the class you need to stay ahead. Join us in person on February 5th from 9:30 a.m. to 12 p.m. for an expert-led training session with the incredible Annette Panzek. Annette will walk you through all pages of the new contract, changes to every addendum, and explain how these changes will impact your transactions. Whether you're new to real estate or a seasoned pro, this class is packed with the knowledge you need to navigate these changes with confidence. Register on our website, trarealtors.net, or call the TRAR office at 815-744-4520 for assistance. Spaces are limited, so don't wait. Reserve your spot today. TRAR, the right association and resources to help you succeed. Be informed, be prepared, be successful. We'll see you on February 5th.
Welcome to the Real Estate Ripple, where every conversation makes waves in the world of real estate. I'm Christy.
I'm Joe.
I'm Megan.
And I'm Carl. And each week we bring you the latest insights, expert advice, and game-changing tips on everything from market trends and lending strategies to local developments right here in Joliet and beyond.
Whether you're a seasoned realtor, a mortgage pro, or just passionate about property market, this podcast is the one that's going to keep you informed and inspired.
So let's dive in and make some ripples together.
Hello, I'm Christy Murawski, and I'm here with my co-host,
Megan Wentland.
And we are super excited to have the lovely
Gary Mueller. I've never been called lovely before. Thank you.
You're welcome. And
Annette Panzek
with us to discuss the new 8.0 multi-board residential real estate contract. Please note, this is not a podcast that will replace any actual training of the 8.0. I know that the Three Rivers has had many trainings. We have another one coming up, which Annette is hosting on February 5th at 9 a.m. here at Three Rivers, and you can go online to the Three Rivers website and register now. However, today we are going to be discussing some of the key changes and highlighting some of the main areas that we think, once you're familiar with the 8.0, would be worth it in order to kind of dive into a little bit more. So thank you so much, first and foremost, for joining us today. Can we just quickly go over a main overview of some of the items that we would like to kind of highlight that realtors need to be aware of when presenting this contract?
Well, thank you very much for allowing us to present today. A couple of things. First off, there are some major changes to the as-is paragraph, which we're going to go through in depth today. There are obviously additional addenda, which were never in the other prior iterations of the multi-board contract. That will, for those of us who are more experienced and older, when we had the Three Rivers contract, we had a number of addenda. One of the reasons that we went from the Three Rivers contract to the multi-board series was in part because they didn't have those addenda. So we didn't have to worry about forgetting or remembering certain things. So now the 8.0, just so everyone knows, has a number of those addenda as well. And I think there are other changes that Annette wanted to mention as well.
Yeah, and thank you again for having me here as well. And one of the big things is rearranging. A lot of the things that came first now are a little bit later in the contract and vice versa. There's been changes to the personal property portion. A lot of personal property has been added. The compensation has now been added in as opposed to having be a separate addendum. As Gary mentioned, the as-is and inspection, big thing that we'll talk about. Financing paragraph has some tweaking to it as well. The cancellation of prior contract, there's some extra provisions in there, which are very nice. There's an alternative energy portion as well, which was not there before. And then also the addenda paragraph, a lot of things were added there and changed there. So there's quite a bit of format change and then quite a bit of content change as well.
And it's super nice to have all that smart home stuff added in.
I love that it's all included.
Definitely.
Yes, especially the
great.
compensation and everything. Like, it just makes it simpler.
Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Less paperwork, less writing.
Yes.
We're all about it, right?
The one place.
Yes.
Well, and also less likely to forget.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And less likely for agents to be trying to add language that they shouldn't be adding.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So how does the modified as is paragraph interact with the inspection options? So we've noticed the switch in language for as is, and can you explain how paragraphs 14 and 15 vary?
Sure. There are a couple of major changes. And most importantly, I'm hoping that our Realtor friends make sure that you concentrate on learning this part of the contract for sure, because this will potentially be a major problem if certain things are missed, especially if they were missed unintentionally. So you'll find in paragraphs 14 and 15, 14 now says as is condition. Now, I was part of the actual committee that created the document. We spent an awful lot of time on this paragraph, trying to make it easier and more understandable. I don't know that we were successful, but I think that through practice and through study and through understanding what these provisions mean, hopefully it will make it much better for everybody. So the initial paragraph 14 is now as is. You need to initial that if in fact that applies. It says that the seller does not make any representation or warranties concerning the condition, but also accepts out paragraph 7, which is the paragraph that talks about personal property items. So you could still have an as-is contract for the condition of the premises, but still rely on paragraph 7 to make sure that the personal property items actually function and work. If you fail to initial paragraphs B or C, it will be presumed that an inspection has been waived. So that's one of the major
answered
concerns.
my next question.
Yeah, that's one of the major concerns for practitioners, is that you may unwittingly end up waiving an inspection for your client, which everybody thought they were going to have.
I feel like we need to say that louder for the people in the cheap seats.
Yes.
Like, don't waive your inspection for your client.
Unless, of course, you have a client that absolutely has already lived there. For example, it's a tenant and they're buying the house that they've been living in forever. Sometimes they will. But overall, make sure, because this could be a major problem, if you as the agent unwittingly forget to do that, and then your client all of a sudden says, wait a minute, I thought I could have an inspection. The initial paragraph 14 says that the buyer does have a right to have an inspection. So paragraph 14A says that the buyer acknowledges that they have the right to the inspection and they are choosing not to. B is a right to inspection with requests. What the heck does that mean? Well, it means that they could do the inspection, they can make requests, and then there's usually a discussion, negotiation that will go on between the buyer and the seller's attorneys. It does stress what everybody had used before, which was that major components would be the concern for this particular paragraph. They did add structural or mechanical components, which had not been present in prior iterations of the contract. It does stress and it bolds that if a buyer requests any repairs or conditions to be addressed that are not major issues and are not subject to the paragraph, that the seller can then terminate the deal, which that's a bit of a concern. It's actually in bold. It was in the 7.0, but now we're trying to stress it more in this contract. And C, it just says you have the right to inspect with no requests. So you're basically, that's more akin, in my view, to what used to be the understanding of an as-is, which was go ahead and do your inspection. Don't come back to me and ask me for $10,000 here, $5,000 there, $100 here, a new window, a new blind, or whatever. What I see in my practices is oftentimes on the 7.0, you would get an as-is contract, and then the other attorney would send you a note that says, we understand it's as-is, but, we thought that the gutter was going to work or something. Well, now it makes it specific and clear that if the buyer makes that request when they were not supposed to, the seller can then declare the contract null and void, and we go forward.
So off of that, I do have a quick question because, and I do think, correct me if I'm wrong, we almost have to remove what as is we believed was before, because the 14 was almost combined with what is now 15C in the previous understanding of it. But now the as is condition is more that the seller is saying, my property is as is, and everyone's acknowledging it. And then the buyer is saying, okay, we understand it's as is. However, we are not going to have an inspection, or we are going to have an inspection and possibly ask, or we are going to have an inspection but not asking.
Right.
Correct? Okay.
Correct.
But then with C, so sometimes you see that people would do the old as is clause, and I'm putting that in air quotes, because they would then come back and say, well, radon, I can't see it, I can't smell it, but we did a radon test, and that's something that was then requested, or mold. And those are some bigger items that maybe fall into that health and safety. Is that something that there could still be a caveat to, or does C completely remove all of that? And you just have to say, if radon comes back high, we're buying it no matter what, or they can terminate it. And also, like, if something like that does happen, are we as agents able to ask informally say something to the other agent, or is that now stepping in and can challenge our buyer's earnest money?
So when you're dealing with as is, one of the big things about as is understanding that the seller still has to fill out all of the disclosures. That does not go away. So I just want to make that point. And it is saying that they still have to disclose any other known defects, as we do as well as professionals. So when using the as is paragraph and then jumping to 15, and as you said, could choose not to do one, an inspection at all, can choose to do one with request. So that's a conversation we need to have with our clients from the very beginning as agents, saying, do you think if something major comes up that you're going to want to ask the seller to do this, or are you just going to plan to just walk away? We have to know that up front, because then if our client is like, well, I might want to, well, then right to inspect with request. Worst thing the seller's going to do is say no. If the intention, though, is of the parties that we're going to be asking for no requests, okay, so let's say high radon, using your example, does come in. At this point, the best practices will be for the agent, if the buyer's agent wants to give the listing agent a call and say, we have some problems, not mentioning what those problems are. We have some major problems. My buyer is planning to cancel the contract. And then at that point, listing agent should go to seller and saying, there are problems. We don't know what they are. The buyer is going to be canceling. Do you want to know what the problems are? Because this paragraph, just like the previous one, does say that if the seller or the seller's attorney asks for the inspection or what's wrong with the property, then certainly it can be disclosed at that point. So then certainly the seller can be given a copy of the inspection reports, and then the seller could say to the buyer, well, hold on here. We see that there are these issues. Do you want to negotiate? Now, so that puts it into the seller now going, do you want to do anything here? Another option, let the buyer cancel. And then as a buyer's agent, then we can go, okay, now we are going to now submit a new contract, a new offer. And here's what we're asking for as a result of our offer, that, hey, now we want to take the price down this amount due to what came up during our inspection. Seller, do you want to have hit the microphone? Seller, do you want to have, a conversation regarding this? And then go from there. I think that would be a better way to handle this, because certainly the seller can go, nope, don't want to deal with you at all, go away. Or the seller can go, yeah, let's have a conversation about this. What's wrong? What do you want? And let's go from there. And a lot of this is going to be market driven too. Seller has multiple offers. They may say, no, I don't want to talk to you. Right. Seller may go, you know what? You're the first offer we've had in, 3 months. Let's talk. So it kind of leaves it open to, there can still be those conversations, but not under this contract unless the seller wants to have those conversations.
Right. I like that you brought that up, because also, we're not supposed to share the inspection information, and radon is an inspection piece. And a lot of times people just send it over. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hey, we have high radon because I just got a phone call about it. And it's like, well, you're technically not supposed to be shooting that over.
And you shouldn't be doing that on the previous one. Right. The 15B either, because it does say buyer shall not send any portion of the inspection report. And when we say buyer, that also does extend to agents of the buyer.
I've had many times, unfortunately, where someone has, I'll say inadvertently, as opposed to purposely, sent me something I didn't ask for. And I will immediately respond by saying, I didn't ask for this. I didn't read it. I didn't open it.
I do the same thing as a lender. If I get an inspection, please don't send me that.
Yeah. I just acknowledge I didn't open it. I'm going to act as if I didn't get it.
Yep.
So the only way we will then address it is if between the parties, they've decided, especially with radon, the number's too high, and we realize going forward, that's going to likely be a reoccurring problem. I have had situations, though, where the level's 4.0 or greater. I've had some that have said it was a radon issue, and then we find out that it's 2.3. because there is a standard out there, West Coast, that says that if it's over 2, that's a problem.
Huh.
I have to remind them that this is Illinois,
That's
and we don't do that.
Can we really quickly just go back to, you mentioned lines 65 and 66. In regards to what is the responsibility of line 65 and 66 when the as-is paragraph says that it does not pertain to line 65 and 66?
What it's really trying to say is you can have an as-is deal, meaning the condition of the entirety of the residence. Lines 65 and 66 deal with personal property items. So I can say, and I, as seller, represent to the buyer, these things all work. These things are all operational. They're functional. They're doing the work for which they're entitled or intended. So that's a different representation by the seller than the as-is. So it's simply making sure everybody understands as-is doesn't all of a sudden mean that all the things I thought as a buyer that I thought the refrigerator worked, that all of a sudden you, seller, can now tell me the refrigerator doesn't work. What would happen in that regard, I think, in reality is you simply wouldn't check the refrigerator or the stove or whatever in the personal property paragraph if it's not working.
Yeah. Or even put that it's not working.
Correct.
Yeah. So it would be on line 66, except refrigerator, except humidifier. Humidifier is a big one, right? Except humidifier, except whatever. These things are not working. So that would be the best way. And again, we have to be truthful in our representations, even though it is an as-is agreement. We do have to still go, this doesn't work. This doesn't work. Even though, as Gary said, it is a personal property item. Disclosures still need to be made as to whether or not something is working or not working, if, in that particular case, if we know that it's not.
Perfect. Okay, so moving on to seller representation paragraphs, we did notice where we had the switch, if you're familiar with a 6.0. 6.0, we did not have to initial next to some of the items, but now, then in 7.0 we did, and now in the 8.0, that's been changed. So I'm talking about paragraph 24, which is seller representations regarding notifications and knowledge. So we see that the sellers and buyers do not have to initial next to items H, I, J, K, and L. If a seller has a property and they are aware it has had improvements, and the realtor is aware of this because of the listing agreement highlighting those items, and those items are specifically if they had improvements that the required building permits were not obtained, had improvements not on their tax assessment, improvements that are eligible for the home improvement tax exemption, proposed unconfirmed or pending specials, or any special assessment that has not been paid in full by the seller, what would you recommend for a realtor to do in order to protect the seller as well as themselves, since we're aware, and what would you suggest for that?
Well, just like any of the previous ones that are in there, A through H, before, where we did not have to initial those, right? It would have made sense. Well, if we're going to initial I through L, we might as well be initialing A through H individually. Mm-hmm. So let's say I do know that there's a lot line dispute.
Yeah.
I would go ahead and cross that out, make sure the seller initials, make sure the buyer initials, and we go from there. And that would be any of these. Perfect. If we are aware of the fact that this is not true, right, then cross it out. Initial, have both parties initial, and we're good to go.
And then I think in lines 363 to 366, it suggests that if I, seller, figure this out, I don't know what your delay would have been, but if all of a sudden you have a kismet moment and figure out, oh my gosh, I forgot to tell you this, then the seller still is obligated to inform the buyer that there's a concern from A to L. That's likely going to be done through attorney modification review. So the ultimate, as we all know, is disclosure. We need to make sure that buyers and sellers know exactly what's going on. And whatever way gets us to that, I think is very beneficial. But minimally make sure that it's covered, and it's covered all the way through closing.
Yeah. And a good example of that would be the boundary outline disputes. Yeah. All of a sudden, the seller is made aware. Neighbor comes knocking on their door and says, hey, I'm putting up a fence. I had a survey done, and your fence is on my property. Get it off. And we're in the middle of a transaction. Well, the seller didn't know about it. Now they do know about it. Happened to me. And they now do know about it. Now, they've got just because at the time of the contract, they didn't know about it. This, as Gary pointed out, now line 364 to 367 says now we do need to make sure that the buyer is made aware of the fact that this now does exist where we didn't know that it did.
And the time when I have seen it, it's been honestly with special assessments where seller, I don't know, was asleep at the switch and has just been paying these bills and not really knowing what they're for, who then has asked for typically a paid assessment letter. And now all of a sudden they find out, oh my gosh, I have a special assessment and I forgot to tell the buyer, so I probably should. Unfortunately, that situation, when it did happen in the past, so under 7.0 before, sometimes that actually killed the deal because you have a very extensive special assessment that was $15,000 over 10 years or something. And there's still 8 years left over. Well, there's always the back and forth on who has to pay for that, but sometimes that becomes an issue going forward because a buyer didn't realize that now I have to actually budget in that special assessment that I even know about.
I love this because I think that I've heard realtors at times say that they're nervous about crossing anything out because they're nervous that they're practicing law. But I love that you guys went over this because it is that clarity that I think is so important for us to know that cross it off, initial it, and then both parties are aware and we're not giving something that is, false sense of security to the buyer.
Yeah. Practicing law comes in when you're adding language.
Yeah.
Like I'm adding
Changing
an action. I'm changing the provisions of the contract in the sense that I'm adding language to it. But we are certainly, as brokers, allowed to cross off items, cross off lines, paragraphs that don't apply. We're allowed to fill in blanks. We're just not allowed to add addendums that we've written. Our clients can write them. Their attorneys can write whatever they want. And
thank you very much.
You're welcome. I looked at you when I said that. And certainly, that is okay. But we can't write that language.
Right.
We can fill in blanks, cross things out. Absolutely fine.
Right.
But always make sure it's initial if we are crossing stuff out.
So regarding the buyer's commission and listing fees, so if there's a listing fee of the seller, can they counter offer to credit the percentage amount minus the dollar amount?
Sure. That is one way to go. The better way to go, as we all learned math in pre-license, is to go back to that math that we learned in pre-license, not to be facetious, it's important to understand that the contract language, so this contract, any contract, sales contract language is going to override anything that's in the listing agreement.
Got it.
So that's going to be really important to kind of understand that. So whatever the seller and buyer are negotiating as far as what the compensation that's going to be paid to the buyer's brokerage is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If it can be done in a percentage amount, then obviously we would check mark on line 33 and then put in the percentage amount. If it gets a little bit more complicated, maybe there's something that needs to be added to that percentage or subtracted from that percentage. Well, then in that particular case, what we're going to be doing at that point is taking out our calculators once we've figured out our sale price. Yep. Do the math, figure it out. Okay, this percentage, and I'm going to subtract or add this dollar amount to it. Then instead of check marking on 33, I'm going to check mark on 34 and then put an actual dollar amount in there. That way there's no misunderstandings.
There's no question.
Yeah, there's no misunderstandings between the buyer and seller, and then no misunderstandings as far as the agents go. And then, that is very important. Both brokerages do need to send over those compensation statements to the title company to make sure that everybody's on the same page. But keeping in mind, if you are that listing broker, you cannot be changing the contract unilaterally. It doesn't matter what your listing agreement says. That's between your brokerage and that seller, just like the buyer's payment is between the buyer and
contract
their
is the
brokerage.
end all.
But that agreement between the buyer and the seller is that between the buyer and sellers, and the brokerages are not a party to this contract.
And to follow up on what Annette just said, as a practice tip, I, as the attorney, would really prefer to have a statement from both agents, mainly because I don't know really until typically too late in the game who's paying what and who's getting paid by whom. The separate statements will then give me not only that information, but will also give me the exact dollar amount. Because the key is that I want to make sure that the compensation is correct. And though more and more often now, agents are showing up at closings. In the old days, they showed up all the time, but especially in those times, usually it appears to me we have a problem when an agent's not there. So I can't turn to him or her and say, is this number right? So your closing statement, or your compensation statement is what I then can rely on to make sure I'm going to get you a check that's right.
Perfect. So once more, just make sure buyers and sellers agents both send them over so that there's total clarity on that.
Right.
Yep.
Perfect. One other thing too, going back to that percentage conversation with the possible fee. So obviously the buyer is the one who normally fills out the contract to the seller first, generally. And the buyer's agent, or, on behalf of the buyer's request, would do the percentage that they're requesting for the compensation. Normally, they wouldn't know if the seller is asking for their selling fees of the agent to be covered. So when they send over the original offer and it gets, maybe they're negotiating the price a little bit and the price might vary a little bit. After that, can we cross off the percentage and then go to the flat rate once it's all agreed to if the price does fluctuate?
Of course, as with anything, like, you would just cross out the percentage, both parties would initial, and then check mark on line 34 before the dollar amount, check mark that, put the dollar amount in. So certainly, and that could be even done with personal property where the seller, all of a sudden says, well, wait a minute, I don't want to leave my refrigerator. So seller crosses out the refrigerator, that's already check marked. Both parties initial that the refrigerator does not stay. It's the same concept as that. And keeping in mind that buyer, seller can certainly negotiate anything they want as far as compensation goes. And, again, that's going to be part of this contract. And buyer could ask for one thing, seller can certainly counter something else.
Okay. Last question before we wrap up here. So we know the 8.0 is out there as of February 1st, and it's supposed to be in full force and effect on March 1st. Can we just really quickly discuss what happens if we receive an offer on, say, March 15th on one of our listings that was written on a 7.0 or other form? Can we negotiate it, or do we need to do a little bit more checks into some background, or can we ask them to do the 8.0? What would you recommend?
So that's really going to be up to the seller and the buyer, which contract as far as they want to use, as far as, let's say that one from another association comes in that does not use the 8.0, both, buyer and seller can decide which one they want to go with. Now, if I am in an area, which I am, which uses the 8.0, that's going to be the one that I'm most familiar with, which then my E&O insurance, and Gary's going to touch on this a little bit, that would be one of my concerns as a brokerage, that my E&O insurance may not cover me if I'm using a contract that is not commonly used in the area. However, let's say that the 7.0 is used and the parties do come to an agreement with the 7.0. That doesn't negate the contract by any means. It just could be an issue as far as if there is a problem where the E&O insurance has to come in, and now the E&O insurance could say, we're not going to cover you, brokerage, because you used a contract that is not commonly used in the area. But there always is going to be a little bit of an overlap where agents may not even know the 8.0 exists, much less,
they've been living under a rock.
They've been living in, or a cave or something like that. Yeah.
That's a good point. Really good point.
The key, I think, from the legal standpoint is simply, and I've done this before when there was a transfer or transition from 6.1 to 7.0, there was a time frame, as Annette was correctly pointed out, where there was like a grace period. However, typically, love to say it's not market driven, but sometimes it is. If you want to make sure that your offer is legit and accepted and is first in line, I guess, make sure you got the right form. If you don't, double check with your carrier to make sure that it's okay that you're still within that time frame where you're covered, even using a prior contract, and that you're not putting yourself out there for potential liability because you're using the wrong form. I have had times in that transition from 6.1 to 7.0 where I would send a letter to the other side and say, thank you very much for sending this. Please submit under at that point, the 7.0 contract. Obviously, after talking with my client seller, typically, and he or she would say, yeah, we want to have it on the right form. So it will come down to that. There will come a time, though, when the grace period is gone, and you just need to double check with your carrier to make sure that you're covered, because we really don't want to walk any of our realtor friends into a problem that they could have avoided simply by making an extra phone call.
Good point. Yes. Thank you for that.
In other words, don't be lazy and use the 7.0 because you're familiar with it. Get yourself familiar with the 8.0. That's going to be
plenty of opportunities too. So just a reminder that training is February 5th at 9:30 here at Three Rivers. And Is there going to be an outline tutorial like the 7.0 had?
I believe there is going to be, yes.
Awesome.
Awesome.
And the only other quick thing I'm going to add is, and I mention this every time I'm lucky enough to present to anybody, whatever attorney with whom you're working, please make sure that he or she is aware of the 8.0 and the concerns and issues with the 8.0. Because once again, you as the agent have done all the hard work to get us to a point. Don't have a situation where the attorney who doesn't know what he or she is doing that could screw up your deal. We, from the Will County Bar Association standpoint, I'm the chairman of the real estate committee. We will have and have had an outline for attorneys to use to say, by the way, look out for this and this and this and this. With the 8.0, we'll have probably 6 major points to be aware of, as well as the addenda, which many practitioners weren't used to having those with a multi-board contract. So just know that those forms are out there. Make sure that you familiarize yourself and make sure you're working together with somebody who knows what's going on.
Well, thank you again, Gary and Annette. We really appreciate you being here. And once more, February 5th, 9:30 a.m. with Annette.
Be here.
Be here in person.
You got to show up, know what you're doing.
And we're going to go through the entire contract from page 1 all the way to page 14. So we will go through it so that everybody understands what it says.
Love it.
And the addendums, because there's lots of fun addendums too. So we will definitely touch on those as well.
All right.
Good stuff.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
guys.
guys.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
That's a wrap for this episode of the Real Estate Ripple. We hope you're walking away with some valuable insights and a fresh perspective on the world of real estate.
Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Whether you're on the go or closing deals, we've got you covered every week.
And if you enjoyed today's show, we'd love for you to leave a review and share the Real Estate Ripple with fellow realtors, lenders, and anyone who wants to stay ahead of ever-changing market.
Until next time, keep making waves in real estate and remember, every ripple counts.